Hello my fellow true crime addicts, my name is Morgana Rose and welcome to my channel. Now since Valentine's Day is very quickly approaching, I thought I would do a case that somewhat related to Valentine's Day. So this case is the murder of Tara Lynn Grant by her husband Stephen Grant. So be sure to get comfy, make sure you have your drink of choice. Mine's always a southern sweet tea, and let's get into it. So, a little background is Tara went to high school at Mid-Penn High School, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And friends of Tara's described her as an exceptional student. She was involved in a lot of extracurriculars. She was an athlete, like a cheerleader and a basketball player. She was very goal-oriented. She had aspirations to do something with her life. Now, friends of Stevens in high school described him as somewhat of opposite. He wasn't involved in extracurriculars, and he was just an average kid. Sounds like he was just an average kid with average grades, and he didn't really stand out or leave a lasting impression on anybody. But eventually, Tara and Stephen, they crossed paths at Michigan State University. And she was a student in the business school, and he had recently left the college to take a job working at a former state senator's office because his aspirations were in politics. So, and I found a really quick story that I thought was kind of interesting, and maybe it's has something to do, it is indicative of his character. But when they were newly dating, and so new that she hadn't even told her family about him yet, her grandmother had died. So she went home, of course, she went home for the funeral. Well, he showed up there in her hometown, completely unannounced, where she was probably like, he just shows up at their funeral and she's like, hey, family, this is Stephen, this is the man I've been dating. And I guess that could be thought as thoughtful or considerate that he was there for her. Well, apparently it didn't scare her off because he proposed to her a little later on the steps of an art museum in Detroit, Michigan, and they were married in September of 1996. Stephen couldn't find another job in politics. Apparently that was a bad year for the Democratic Party, and like I said, that's where his political aspirations were. So he went to work with his dad in a machine shop. His dad owned a machine shop. It was a tool and die shop, and it was called USG Babbitt. And Tara got a job, it was a temporary job working for Morrison Knudsen, which was eventually acquired by Washington Group, and these are engineering firms. Now, in November of 2000, they had their first child. It was a girl, and they named her Lindsay. And then in November of 2002, so 2 years later, they had a little boy named Ian. Tara, she quickly began working her way up the business ladder. Like I said, she had big dreams for her career, and eventually she became an operations manager at Washington Group International. So that same company, but Washington Group International. So this job required her to travel a lot. This right here alone put a lot of stress on their marriage because this job involved her being gone on the weekdays and home on the weekends. So Stephen, who began to refer to himself as Mr. Mom, was responsible for the day-to-day runnings of the home and the children while he was working full-time. But Tara was the breadwinner. She was a clear breadwinner in this family. And because of her, they lived in a really nice home. They lived in a nice upper-class neighborhood. They drove new cars. Their kids went to private school. But like I said, sacrifices were made for her to be as successful as she was. And that was her frequent trips out of the country to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where she went for work. So she flew out on Mondays, and then she returned back home on Friday afternoons to spend the weekend with her husband and her children. And they decided what was best for their family was to hire an 18-year-old German au pair that lived in their home to help take care of the children. Now, the details and the timeline of the events, they get a little confusing. So when I was researching this and I wanted it to make as much sense as I could, I decided that I would talk about this the way the police found out. About the case, because I thought that would make the most sense and it would be the easiest to follow. So I'm going to go forwards and then I'm going to have to go backwards afterwards. So, on February 14th, 2007, Valentine's Day, Stephen Grant went to the Macomb County Sheriff's Office to report his wife missing. And he said that she's been missing for 5 days. But he said it wasn't unusual for his wife to have disappeared, which is why he had waited so long to report her. He said that she came home on Friday night, which was February 9th, and she informed him that while she was unpacking, she was upstairs in the bedroom, and she was unpacking her suitcase, and she told him that she had to return to Puerto Rico a day early, which would be on Sunday. So they got into an argument about it, which I found justifiable. I mean, I know it was for her job, and I get it, but if it was me, I would be upset if my husband was leaving a day earlier than I had planned, because I would just want as much time as possible to be a family together. So I get that. I get him being upset that she just pulled that on him. But he said, but then he said he heard her on the phone after the argument saying, "I'll meet you at the end of the driveway." And then she just took her suitcase and she left. And Stephen called and left voicemails for her because he wasn't getting any answers. And he said he called her boss in Puerto Rico and he called her family, but no one seemed worried. And the family said that she's just probably cooling off. Just leave her be. Just give her some time and to just cool your jets, Stephen, because she will contact you when she's ready. So the police went out that night to the Grant house, the night that he reported her missing, and their au pair, which is a nanny, and I'm just going to say nanny now because I feel awkward saying au pair. I'm not even 100%, I don't even know if I'm saying that right. It sounds weird when I say it. So anyway, I'm just going to say nanny from here on out. So their nanny, Verena, was there, and the detectives asked her where she was the night of February 9th when Tara supposedly walked out. And Verena said she was out of the house that night, the night of the fight, that the fight occurred, so she didn't see anything. So the detectives asked Stephen to go to the station the next day to take a lie detector test, and he agreed. He said he would go. However, Stephen never actually showed up to take that test. Meanwhile, the police are doing what they can do to track down Tara's whereabouts, but this is proving out to be very difficult because the first problem was he reported Tara missing 5 days after the fact. So the trail was already growing cold, and she wasn't using her laptop. She wasn't using her cell phone. She wasn't making phone calls. She didn't use her credit cards. She didn't purchase a plane ticket. She didn't have a plane ticket that she used under her name, and her passport hadn't been used. And she also hadn't talked to any of her family since that night. So Stephen hired a lawyer who advised him to stop talking. Now, he may have stopped talking to the police and authorities, but he continued to talk to the media. And he was very upset during all the TV interviews. He was begging his wife to just please come home. He missed him. The kids missed him. Everybody missed her. Not missed him. The kids missed her. He missed her. Everyone missed her so much. And he was really upset. But however, a few days later, his attitude kind of changed, and the tears dried up, and he started bad-mouthing her. And in one of the interviews, he suggested that they had a problem in their marriage, and that she was pretty close to an infidelity. And then another time, he called her an AWOL mom that was more concerned with her career and her frequent flyer miles than being a mom. And I was like, yeah, when I read that, wait. What did I just read? How does that sound like a husband that's missing his wife? He's all upset, and now he's angry. And then, so he was trying to play the sympathy card. He was trying to help his public image of himself. But however, an old girlfriend recently had leaked emails that just 2 weeks before Tara went missing, he contacted her, and in it was some not so subtle come-ons, and one of them being that he said, I think marriage vows are like speed limits. Sometimes you just have to break them. Ugh. Just a dog, he makes me sick. I'm just a creep. Saying those words out loud, he's a creep. So obviously that sympathy card, that wasn't going to last after that came out. Now, the police may not be talking to Stephen, and they don't have any physical evidence, and they have very few leads. but they just had a gut feeling about him because his story was just, it was so full of holes. And since there was no physical evidence that they needed to execute a search warrant of the house, the sheriff, who was Mark Hackle, announced that they were going to search the park by the Grant house. It was called Stony Creek Park. So they decided to make this public. They knew they needed the public's help, and everyone was just following this case so closely and paying attention to every detail in this case that the police knew that they could count on the public's help. So 10 days after Sara was reported missing, Stony Creek Park was swarmed with officials looking for any signs of Tara. Now, the main reason the police chose this particular place that seemed like a random place to start, but it was a park, so I guess we'll search there. But it wasn't that. It was because in the interviews, Stephen kept bringing it up nonstop when he was talking with the media. And he kept saying things like, that park was the main reason they bought the house, and they loved the park, and he loved to run and ride his mountain bike there all the time. And he was very sentimental about that park, and he brought it up, and I guess he brought it up often enough that it made the police suspicious. But unfortunately, after 6 hours and over 150 searchers and sniffer dogs and a helicopter, they came up empty. However, reaching out to the public helped prove to be a very big turning point in this case. 4 days after that big search, so that would be on a Wednesday, February 28th, February 28th, I think, Sheila Warner decided to go walking on trails through the woods, less than a mile from her house. So she knew that those woods were just recently searched, and she wasn't expecting to find anything. However, as she was walking, she saw a 1-gallon Ziploc bag that she could see had blood pooling at the bottom of it. So she, of course, knew about Tara's disappearance, so she took that Ziploc bag and she brought it to her home, and she called the police. And when the police got there, the detective found inside that Ziploc bag, there were gloves, there were metal shavings, along with the blood that was later determined to be human blood. So the blood, along with the fact that Stephen worked in a machine shop, the metal shavings, that was just what was needed to get that search warrant. So at 5 p.m. on Friday, March 2nd, detectives and crime scene techs of the CSI techs, they arrived at the Grant house ready to process the home. Their expectations weren't high because Sara had now been missing for 3 weeks already. On his way home, actually it was really close to his home, I believe it was like in his neighborhood, the police pulled him over and they took him out of the car, they patted him down, but he is not put under arrest. He found out then that his house was being searched. They got a search warrant and they were searching his house. So he asks if he can take his dog for a walk, and they're like, yeah, you can take your dog for a walk. You're not under arrest. We don't have any legal reason to deny you that request. So yeah, sure. So he got the dog and he took the dog for a walk, and he simply just disappears. And no one noticed that he never came back with the dog. That is until 90 minutes into the search. Some of the detectives that were in the house while all of the other people, the CSI team, was doing their work, and they felt like they were just getting in the way. So they went out to the garage. And one of the detectives, Brian Kozlowski, was looking around the garage to see if anything had changed since his first visit, which was way back on February 14th. That was his first and only visit, and that was the day that they went out there after Stephen reported his wife missing. And that's when he noticed a green Rubbermaid type tub that looked out of place, and he knew it wasn't there back on February 14th, the last time he was at the house. So he opened it up and he found a black garbage bag with another garbage bag inside of that. And when he opened that bag up, he found there was blood in it and what looked like a bra. It was quickly discovered that there was a human torso in that tub. No limbs, no head, just a torso, and it still had what was left of the clothes on the body. And they knew immediately that that was Tara. Then Detective Kozlowski had realized that Stephen had been gone and had an hour and a half lead on him. But due to some good clues, they had an idea where Stephen was headed because he used his cell phone and it pinged off of the cell phone towers, and they realized he was heading north, and they found out that he was in a yellow Dodge Dakota that he had borrowed from an unsuspecting friend. Now, right after learning that, Detective Kozlowski, that is a hard name to say for me, he got an unexpected break. While he was sitting at his desk, his phone rang, and he recognized it as an international number. It was Verena, the former nanny. She's former because she was forced to go back to Germany by the company that had hired her. So 2 days after Stephen reported Tara missing, she had to go back to Germany. And she told the detective that she believed everything that Stephen told her and that it was all a lie. She said that Stephen had just called her and he just called her and confessed to kill his wife, but he said it was an accident. Detective Kozlowski believed her, but he wanted to know more about that relationship. So she admitted that their relationship had started to become physical, but it started 4 weeks before his wife had disappeared. The detective, of course, wondered if he had just gotten the motive. He said, wait, did I just get the motive? Stephen murdered his wife because he wanted to be with the 19-year-old nanny, and that nanny already got along with his children. She would just slide right into this family. Verena also provided the area code that came on the phone when she got the phone call from Stephen. She provided that on the caller ID. So he was headed up into northern Michigan. But Stephen didn't only call Verena that night. He also called his sister, who gave her the name of the cabins that he was going, where he intended to take his life. So his sister immediately called Detective Kozlowski. And Detective Kozlowski found the cabins to be in the Wilderness State Park of northern Michigan. The police quickly found that yellow abandoned truck at 6:30 a.m. on Sunday, and they followed the footprints in the snow that led them to Stephen Grant, who was under a tree suffering from hypothermia. He didn't have shoes on, and he didn't have a jacket, and he was taken to the hospital for treatment. And while he was there recuperating, he asked to speak to Detective Kozlowski and Detective McLean. And those were the two original detectives that showed up at his house on February 14th. So they got in their car and they drove up to that hospital in northern Michigan. And while Stephen was laying in bed, he began to tell his version of the story of what happened to his wife. Now, Stephen's attorney sought an emergency court order to bar the release of Stephen's confession and said this could harm his right to a fair trial, but the judge denied it. He denied that request, so we now have the confession. So he told detectives that on February 9th, when Tara returned home from Puerto Rico, there was a fight because she did come in and say she was returning a day early on Sunday. And he accused her of not spending enough time at home. That part of the story is the only truth that he told in that original report, when he made that original report to the police. What actually happened next, according to his confession, which I'm going to link at the bottom because it's really long, it's pages and pages, and it was to both detectives, and it was recorded on tape and then transcribed. So I'm going to summarize what was there and not get into too many of the gruesome details because he described everything he did to Tara in vivid detail. Anyway, after he accused her of spending too much time away from the family, she replied with, well, I have to do what I have to do in my job, and it's none of your business. And then she went to turn away. And when she went to turn away from him, he grabbed her wrist and he told her to stop. You're not going anywhere. We're going to finish this argument right now. We're going to finish this conversation right now. And then he said Tara slapped him. And he just saw red. He then pushed her. And then he pushed her and she fell back on the floor. And she said, that's it. I'm taking the kids. I'm taking the house. You're going to be left with nothing. And then he grabbed her neck and he started to squeeze. And he said at first he just did it because he wanted her to just stop talking. However, once he kept squeezing, he just kept squeezing and kept squeezing, and he wouldn't let go until he knew she was dead. And then he realized that the nanny was going to be coming home. So he sent a text to Verena and said, don't come home right now. And then he dragged her body down the stairs and he put her in the back of her own truck, which was a white Isuzu Trooper. He put her in the cargo area and then he went back to the garage to look for a cargo liner. And then he just set it on top of her body. Then he went back in the house and Verena did come home. I guess he told her, don't come home right now, come back later. And, but then she did come home while Tara's body was out in her car in the garage. He told Verena that they had gotten into a fight and she left and she went back to the airport. And the detectives asked him what happened after that because it was late at night, and they said, so what did you and Verena do all night? He kept saying that they just talked, and then he also said that he couldn't remember. They asked if he stayed awake all night and if he stayed in his room, and he said, I can't remember. Then they asked if Verena went to sleep and if she slept in her room. He said, again, he didn't remember the first night, but he said the next night she slept in his room. He said the next morning, which was Saturday, he went to run errands. He went to the bank, he went to the post office, and then he just was driving around. And he was driving in his Jeep this time, and her Isuzu Trooper was at home in the garage with Tara still in the back. Verena was there, his kids were there. On Sunday morning, he took her to his shop, that machine shop, and then he called his dad just to make sure his dad wasn't going to be coming into work that day for any reason. And the dad said no, so he backed the truck up into the garage. He took her out, he put her on the floor, and then he pulled the truck back out because there wasn't enough room. He then he began with her suitcase, he emptied it, he shredded everything inside of it, and then he put her laptop through the bandsaw and cut it into tiny pieces that flew everywhere. And he did that with the cell phone too, and he put those pieces in a box. And then he took her computer bag and her purse, the stuff that he couldn't shred, and he ended up throwing it, putting it in a bag, and he ended up throwing that in a dumpster in an apartment complex, but that was on a different day. That wasn't right now. And that box that had the computer parts and her phone parts in it, he took that to another dumpster, but not right today. He did that on a different day, but that's where that stuff ended up. Now he had to come up with a plan. He had to formulate a plan of what he was going to do and how he was going to dispose of Tara's body. He contemplated the bandsaw, but then decided that would just be way too messy. And then he remembered there was a hacksaw there, and then he also remembered that his dad had mentioned that there was a bandsaw blade as well. He ended up choosing and using the new bandsaw blade. Then he broke that into 6 pieces, and then he proceeded to cut her apart. I'm not going into the vivid detail of how and what he did while he was mutilating her, but like I said, I linked his confession at the bottom, so feel free to go there and read more about it. He did bring his own Rubbermaid bin from home that he lined with newspaper, and he began putting her body parts in plastic bags, and then he placed them in the bin, and then he wrapped her torso in plastic and put that right on top of the other body parts. He also fit Tara's head in there too. So he had her whole body in one Rubbermaid tub. He also put in there the dirty rags, the blades, the gloves, and anything else that was left over. He fit all of that in the bin. He then loaded that bin back in Tara's truck alongside that bag of shredded documents, and then there was the bag that had her purse and her computer bag, and then the box that had the broken up pieces of the laptop and the phone. He put that in the front seat with him. And then he brought that truck back home. He parked it in the garage, and that's where it stayed parked for the rest of the day and the night. And on Monday, it was early Monday, 3:00 in the morning, he added a red sled to the back of Tara's truck because it was winter there was a lot of snow on the ground, and he had to decide where he was going to leave the body. So he thought about putting it in a dumpster, but then he decided that wouldn't work because the garbage men would pick it up and they would empty it, and then they would discover the body. Then he had decided that he needed to bury her. So his mind immediately went where? To the park by the house, Stony Brook Park. He parked his truck on the road because he didn't want it to get stuck. He unloaded the sled, and then he put that blue Rubbermaid bin, that tote, on top of it. He pulled the sled up a hill, but the hill started dropping away like this, dropping down, and the sled got away from him, and he had to chase that sled with Tara's body in a container on it. And finally, he got it to stop. And when it stopped, it tipped over and Tara's body falls out. So he went ahead and he buried the torso right there in the snow. And then he put her other parts in more bags, body parts in more bags. And he put those bags on top of the sled. And he buried the whole thing underneath the snow. The other stuff like the blades, the gloves, a pair of shoes that he wore, the rags, he just dispersed them. He just threw them in different directions and watched them disappear into the forest, making sure they disappeared and that they were underneath the snow. But then, when he was back home that night, he realized that he did a really bad job of hiding everything. So the next day, Tuesday, he went back and he drove his Jeep this time, and then he unburied everything. He took the parts out of the bags and he reburied them underneath some fallen trees that he had noticed. So then the next day was Wednesday, and that was Valentine's Day, and that was the day that he filed that report that his wife was missing. And that night the police came out to his house, and then the next morning was Thursday, and that's when he hired the lawyer. Then on the day that the sheriff announced that they were going to search the park, Stephen, of course, panicked. This was on a Wednesday, and the search was going to be a few days later on Saturday. So at 5 a.m. Saturday morning, just hours before the search party was due to show up, he went to that wooded part of the park where he buried Tara. He retrieved her torso. He put it in the back of Tara's truck, and he hid it on the roof of his office at his shop. And then he wrapped it in more black plastic bags. And then he brought that torso back to his house after several days because he was afraid it was going to thaw and then start to smell. So then he put it in a green bin because the blue bin got ruined from the first go-round. And he kept that green bin in his garage at his house. And then this was on Thursday night. So Friday he went to work, normal work day. Then when he was coming home, that's when he found out his house was going to be searched. So, he went home, and like I said before, they didn't arrest him. He talked to some people, then he took his dog for a walk, and that's when he disappeared. And that's when he made those phone calls to his sister, and he borrowed that yellow Dodge Dakota, and then he was found, and then he was arrested. Now, all of those details about what Stephen said really happened to his wife, those were all his words. That was his version of what happened. We will never know Tara's version of what happened. However, the prosecution, they had a different take on what really happened and what really went down. And he was the only voice Tara had. He said this was a case of domestic violence murder. He said this wasn't an argument over her traveling so much for her job. This was a beating. He was playing the Mr. Mom sympathy card, the person who took care of the house and took care of the kids. The prosecutor said this wasn't about that. This was about replacing his wife with that young 19-year-old nanny. Because apparently, according to the phone records, the very first thing he did after he murdered his wife was send a text to Verena that said, "You owe me a kiss." What? There were also emails that were recently sent, that he had recently sent to an ex, that were really steamy, and they insinuated a hookup. He called Verena. The prosecutor ended up calling Verena as a witness, and she recounted how flirtatious Stephen had become at the end of January, leading up to him getting her in bed the night before the murder. The lawyer tried so hard to get premeditation, since that was the only way to get first-degree murder charge, which means no opportunity for parole. Unfortunately, the jury didn't rule it that way. On Friday, December 21st, 2007, Stephen Grant was found guilty on the charge of murder in the second degree, and he was sentenced to 50 to 80 years with a minimum of 50 years served. This means Stephen won't be eligible for a parole hearing until he is 87 years old, so he will be safely off the streets for a very long time. Now, this was a tough case to research, and it wasn't because the information was hard to find. It was there, but because of the gruesome, vivid details, especially in Stephen's confession, those transcripts, the way he just recalled what he did, how he did it, his reasoning behind it, how he thought through all of those decisions. It was like at some points I felt like I was reading a Stephen King fiction novel. It just seemed so fictitious and so far-fetched that it couldn't be true. That someone could cut apart a body, not a stranger's body, that's terrible enough. But a husband did this to his wife of 10 years, to the mother of his children. He just removed himself from situation, from the reality, because there is no way he is still thinking of her as his wife anymore at that point. In my opinion, this was very calculated and methodical. Well, that's my Valentine's Day crime, or should I say Valentine's Day case. If you like this video and you want to see more of them, don't forget to like and subscribe. And hit the bell if you want to know when my next video goes up. Thanks for watching. And remember, stay sweet, stay kind, and stay safe. Bye, y'all. I just want to say that I do not mean any disrespect when I'm covering these cases. I'm talking about the facts that I found while researching different websites. And any opinions I have are purely my own. I try as hard as I can to fact check everything and then cross-check information to make sure that what I'm relaying is as accurate as possible. If I got any information wrong, please feel free to email me at morganarose20@gmail.com or comment below. Thanks.